fresh vegetables rot. That is the simple, brutal reality of life before electric cooling existed. And for most of human history, that was the challenge every family faced. You harvest your crops, and within days, sometimes within hours, they begin to break down. So what did people do? They did not simply accept the loss. Across China, communities developed layered, sophisticated systems to keep food edible for weeks, months, and in some cases, even longer. These were not accidents. They were not lucky discoveries. They were the result of generations observing nature, testing methods, and refining techniques until the results were reliable enough to survive winters on. Today, we crack open a refrigerator without a second thought. But before that, Chinese households were solving the same problem with nothing more than salt, sun, time, and an understanding of how microbes behave. And the results they achieved were remarkable. This is the full story of how Chinese households preserved vegetables without refrigeration, and why those methods are still very much alive today. Let us start with the stakes, because they were real. Leafy greens are among the most fragile foods that exist. A bundle of fresh greens left at room temperature can begin wilting within hours. By the next day, it is already losing structural integrity. Within 2 or 3 days in warm weather, it is gone. For a farming household feeding multiple people through a long winter, that kind of rapid spoilage was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Running out of vegetables during winter months meant running out of nutrients, vitamins, and the variety that made meals bearable across cold seasons. Yet, Chinese households were not emptying their shelves by January. They were eating preserved vegetables well into spring. How? The answer was never a single technique. It was a system. Multiple overlapping methods worked together, each suited to different vegetables, different climates, and different storage timelines. Salt drew moisture out and created hostile conditions for harmful bacteria. Fermentation introduced beneficial microbes that outcompeted the dangerous ones. Drying removed the water that bacteria depend on. And seasonal timing meant that preservation efforts happened at exactly the right moment in the calendar, when temperatures supported the process and harvests were at their peak. None of these elements worked in isolation. They were combined, layered, and matched to the specific needs of each household and each region. Northern China, which faces brutal winters, developed different strategies than the humid south. Sichuan developed its own approach shaped by its climate and flavor traditions. The result was a diverse but deeply logical national framework for keeping food alive. The genius of this system was not just chemical, it was practical. These methods required no specialized equipment, no imported materials, and no ongoing energy input. A clay pot, some salt, and a cool corner of the home were often enough. Up next, we start with the simplest weapon in that system, the sun itself, and what happens when you hang vegetables out to dry for days at a time. The sun does something straightforward but powerful to a vegetable. It pulls out water. And water, as it turns out, is the primary ingredient that bacteria and mold need to thrive. Remove the moisture aggressively enough, and you create a food that microbes simply cannot colonize easily. This logic is at the heart of gan kai, which translates directly as dried vegetables. The characters gan and kai mean dry and vegetable respectively, and together they describe one of the oldest preservation methods in Chinese culinary history. The process is honest in its simplicity. Vegetables like mustard greens, cabbage leaves, and radish tops are harvested and then hung up in the open air, usually under direct sunlight, sometimes strung along walls, fences, or wooden racks outside rural homes. The sun and moving air work together to drive moisture out of the plant tissue over several days. What you are left with is a fraction of the original weight, dramatically reduced in volume, and transformed in texture from something soft and perishable into something dry, tough, and shelf-stable. Properly dried, gan kai can last for months without any additional treatment. There is no need for brine, no fermentation vessel, and no ongoing monitoring. You hang the vegetables, let nature do the work, and store the result somewhere dry and away from moisture. The barrier to entry is essentially zero. When it comes time to use them, the process reverses. The dried vegetables are soaked in water and they rehydrate, expanding back toward their original volume. They never fully return to the texture of fresh greens, but that is not the point. Once rehydrated, dried vegetables absorb cooking liquids beautifully. In soups and braises, they soak up broth and become richly flavored. The texture, which would seem like a flaw in a fresh vegetable, becomes a quality in preserved ones. That concentrated, slightly chewy character gives gan kai a depth that fresh greens simply do not possess. This method was especially practical for rural families during harvest time, when more vegetables were available than could be eaten fresh. Rather than letting the surplus rot, they converted it into long-lasting shelf stock. What is interesting is that sun-drying is not the end of the story. Some vegetables benefit from a further step after drying, one that involves salting and aging in ways that transform not just preservation, but flavor entirely. We will get to that. But first, let us look at what happens when you do not dry your vegetables, but instead seal them in salt water and let fermentation begin. If you are from northern China or have eaten northern Chinese food, you already know Sichuan kai. The two characters break down simply. Suan means sour, and kai means vegetable, sour vegetable. That name tells you exactly what this is and how it is made. The sourness is not artificial, not added with vinegar, and not a flavoring agent applied from outside. It is produced by the vegetables themselves, or more precisely, by the bacteria that live on their surfaces and thrive under the right conditions. The process begins with Napa cabbage, which is one of the most widely grown and consumed vegetables in northern China. The cabbage is first salted. Salt plays a dual role here. It begins drawing moisture out of the cabbage leaves through osmosis, which helps create the brine that the vegetables will eventually be submerged in. It also immediately begins suppressing the types of bacteria that would cause rot. The cabbages are then packed tightly into containers and weighted down so that the brine covers everything. Air exposure is the enemy of this process, so keeping everything submerged is critical. What happens next is fermentation driven by lactic acid bacteria, which are naturally present on the surface of vegetables and in the surrounding environment. These bacteria thrive in the low-oxygen, salty environment that has been created. As they eat the natural sugars in the cabbage, they produce lactic acid as a byproduct. That acid gradually lowers the pH of the entire environment. And as the pH drops, the environment becomes increasingly hostile to spoilage organisms. The lactic acid bacteria have essentially acidified their own home in a way that kills off competition while they continue to thrive. The result is Suan kai, tangy, slightly crunchy, deeply flavored preserved cabbage that can last through an entire winter. In Heilongjiang, Jilin, and other northeastern provinces, Suan kai is not a condiment or a side curiosity. It is a staple. It appears in hot pots, pork and sauerkraut stews, and dumpling fillings. Its sourness cuts through rich fatty foods in a way that feels almost designed for the heavy, warming meals of northern winters. The timing of Suan kai production is closely connected to the agricultural calendar. Late autumn, when cabbages reach maturity and temperatures begin to drop, is when households traditionally prepare their winter supply. The cooler air helps regulate the fermentation, preventing it from moving too fast. And that relationship between season and fermentation is something we will keep returning to. But before that, let us travel southwest to Sichuan, where a different kind of fermented vegetable has its own vessel, its own logic, and its own devoted following. In Sichuan, the fermented vegetable tradition takes a different form. Pao kai means soaked or submerged vegetable. That description gives you the essential picture. Unlike Suan kai, which is prepared as a single large batch for the winter, Pao kai uses a different concept built around a continuously maintained brine that lives in a dedicated jar. The Pao kai jar is a specific vessel. It has a water-sealed rim that allows gases to escape while preventing outside air from getting in. This design is not accidental. It maintains the low oxygen environment that lactic acid bacteria need to do their work. And because the brine inside is never fully discarded, it builds up a complex population of beneficial microorganisms over time. An older Pao kai jar, one that has been maintained for years, has a richer and more developed culture than a newly started one. Some families guard these jars and the cultures within them carefully, treating the starter liquid as a valuable asset. Vegetables are added to this living brine and left to ferment. The established bacterial population gets to work immediately, and because the culture is already active and abundant, fermentation happens quickly. Where suan kai takes weeks to develop, pao kai can be ready to eat within days, sometimes even faster. Radishes, green beans, cabbage, carrots, and chilies are all commonly used. The result is a crisp, tangy, aromatic preserved vegetable, with a profile shaped by both the fermentation and the spices that Sichuan cooks add to their brine. The flavor of pao kai is different from suan kai. It is brighter, often more complex from added aromatics, and can vary dramatically from household to household, depending on what spices and vegetables are used and how long things are left to ferment. Some versions are mildly sour and fresh tasting, others are deeply tangy and pungent. What makes pao kai particularly clever as a system is its self-renewing quality. The brine is never wasted. As vegetables are removed, new ones are added. The culture continues. The jar keeps working. In a sense, a well-maintained pao kai jar is a living kitchen tool, and it connects the cook to a continuous tradition of fermentation that stretches back generations. But not all preservation methods rely on fermentation at all. Sometimes the simplest approach, pure salt applied in large quantities, is what gets the job done. Some techniques do not require fermentation vessels, specific temperatures, or carefully managed bacterial cultures. Some rely on a single ingredient, applied without restraint. Heavy salting, where vegetables are packed densely with large quantities of salt and then pressed or weighted down, is one of the most direct and effective preservation methods in the Chinese culinary toolkit. The mechanics are straightforward. Salt is hygroscopic, meaning it pulls moisture toward itself. When packed around or layered through vegetables, it draws water out of the plant tissue aggressively. The vegetables shrink and release their liquid. That liquid, now heavily saturated with salt, forms a brine in which harmful microbes cannot survive. The salt concentration is simply too high for them. The water activity of the food drops below the threshold that most spoilage organisms need to function. Preservation happens not through beneficial bacteria, but through the creation of an environment so inhospitable that nothing grows. Vegetables preserved this way are shelf-stable for a long time. They do not require any monitoring or active management. You pack the salt, apply weight to press out liquid and keep things compressed, and store the container somewhere cool. The food waits until you need it. The obvious trade-off is sodium content. By the time you are ready to eat the preserved vegetable, it is intensely salty, far beyond what most palates would find pleasant. So, before cooking or eating, the vegetable is soaked in fresh water and rinsed to remove the excess salt. This step requires patience, but is simple enough that it adds minimal complexity to the overall process. After rinsing, the vegetable is edible, with its texture changed by the salt treatment, but its flavor more than acceptable once cooked. This method was especially practical for large volumes of vegetables during peak harvest, when more was coming in than could be fermented or dried quickly. Salt packing could absorb surplus production rapidly and hold it safely for months. It is a blunt tool, but in the preservation toolkit, blunt tools have their place. What is fascinating is that some vegetables were taken a step further, undergoing both salting and partial drying before being aged into something with a flavor profile that fresh or simply salted vegetables could never achieve. Mei kai is one of the most distinctive preserved vegetables in Chinese cooking. The characters Mei and Kai appear together frequently in the context of Hakka and Cantonese cuisine, though the method has spread well beyond those specific culinary regions. Making Mei kai involves multiple stages, each contributing to a final product that is layered in flavor and reliably shelf-stable. The starting material is mustard greens, known in Chinese as jie kai, a leafy vegetable with a slightly bitter and peppery character when fresh. The greens are first salted, which initiates moisture removal and begins transforming the texture. After salting, they are not immediately packed away. Instead, they are partially dried. This intermediate drying step reduces moisture further, without fully dehydrating them the way gan kai is dried. They retain some flexibility and density. After the drying phase, the partially dried and salted mustard greens are aged. This aging process is where Mei kai develops its defining character. Over time, the remaining moisture, the salt, and the compounds within the plant tissue interact. The color deepens into a dark brown or near black. The smell becomes earthy and pungent, and the flavor develops the kind of concentrated umami depth that fresh vegetables simply cannot produce. It is something between fermented and cured, rich without being sharp. That flavor makes meikai indispensable in certain classic dishes. The most iconic pairing is meikai ku ru, braised pork belly with preserved mustard greens. In this dish, the fat from the pork renders into the preserved greens during slow cooking, while the greens simultaneously contribute their concentrated savory flavor to the meat. The two ingredients transform each other. Neither tastes as good alone as they do together. It is a dish that could only exist because of the preservation process that creates meikai. Shelf life is significant. Properly made meikai keeps for months without refrigeration, making it a reliable pantry staple for households far from fresh produce markets. And its flavor only adds to dishes rather than requiring concealment, unlike some heavily salted preserved foods that need careful rinsing and balancing. Up next, we explore how vinegar enters the picture as a precision tool for controlling the microbial environment. Salt and fermentation are not the only routes to an acidic, bacteria-hostile environment. Vinegar, which is itself the product of fermentation, provides that acidity directly. Chinese households have long used vinegar as a pickling medium, applying it to a range of vegetables including garlic, cucumbers, cabbage, and various roots to create preserved foods that are tangy, crisp, and microbiologically stable. The chemistry is simple. Vinegar is acetic acid diluted in water. Acetic acid is toxic to the types of bacteria that cause food spoilage and foodborne illness. When vegetables are submerged in a vinegar solution, the acid penetrates the tissue and lowers the pH throughout. Bacteria attempting to colonize the vegetable face an environment that disrupts their cellular function. Most cannot survive it. Unlike fermentation, which creates acidity gradually as bacteria do their work over days or weeks, vinegar pickling achieves the acidic environment immediately. This means the preserved vegetables are ready faster. There is no waiting for a culture to develop, no monitoring of fermentation progress, no concern about whether the right bacteria are winning. You submerge the vegetables in vinegar solution, possibly with salt and sugar and aromatics added, and the pickling happens quickly. The result is a different flavor profile than fermented vegetables. Vinegar-pickled vegetables are sharper, brighter, and often more uniformly sour than fermented ones. Garlic pickled in vinegar loses some of its raw pungency and takes on a mellowed, tangy quality. Cucumbers pickled in vinegar stay crisp and absorb the brine flavors cleanly. These are frequently served as accompaniments to richer, heavier dishes where their acidity cuts through fat and refreshes the palate. Vinegar pickling was particularly useful in warmer regions where fermentation required more careful temperature management. The directness of vinegar gave cooks reliable results across a wider range of conditions. But here is something worth understanding more deeply. Whether it is vinegar, lactic acid fermentation, or salt, all of these methods are working within the same underlying principle. They are all controlling the microbial environment, and that control is never random. Fermentation has an image problem in the modern imagination. People sometimes hear the word and think of something unpredictable, even dangerous. Rotting food dressed up as a tradition, but that framing misses the entire point. Fermentation is not random decay, it is controlled transformation. The difference between a jar of swan kai and a pile of rotting cabbage is not luck, it is management. Every fermentation technique we have discussed in this video involves deliberate control of three variables: salt concentration, temperature, and time. These three factors determine which microorganisms dominate the environment. Add enough salt and you suppress harmful bacteria while creating conditions that lactic acid bacteria can tolerate. Keep the temperature within the right range and you slow down undesirable processes while allowing the beneficial ones to proceed at a manageable pace. Give the process the right amount of time and you allow sufficient acid production without letting the product over-ferment into something inedible. The beneficial bacteria, primarily lactic acid bacteria, produce lactic acid as a metabolic byproduct. That acid does two things simultaneously. It preserves the food by lowering pH below the survival threshold of spoilage, organisms, and pathogens, and it transforms the flavor of the vegetables, adding the tanginess, complexity, and depth that makes fermented vegetables so culinarily valuable. What this means is that skilled fermentation is applied microbiology. even when practiced by people who have never heard that term. Chinese households who mastered Sichuan Kai and Pao Kai were intuitively managing bacterial populations, creating selection pressure that favored the organisms they wanted and eliminated the ones they did not. They did this through observation and accumulated knowledge passed down across generations. The science explains what they were doing. The practice preceded the science by centuries. Understanding fermentation as controlled rather than random also explains why the timing of preservation mattered so much. The right season was not just convenient, it was part of the method. The connection between preservation and the agricultural calendar in China is not coincidental. It reflects a deep understanding of how temperature shapes microbial behavior. Most preservation in traditional Chinese households happened in late autumn, in the weeks before winter fully set in. That timing was not arbitrary. It was essential. When temperatures drop, microbial activity slows broadly. Both the bacteria that cause rot and the bacteria that drive fermentation become less active in cold conditions, but the two types are not equally affected. Spoilage bacteria are often suppressed more strongly by cold than lactic acid bacteria, which can continue to function at lower temperatures. This difference is precisely what late autumn preservation exploited. Starting fermentation when temperatures are cool but not freezing creates a window in which lactic acid bacteria can work steadily, producing acid and lowering pH, while their competitors are sluggish. The fermentation proceeds more slowly than it would in summer heat, but more controllably. There is less risk of the process racing ahead and producing off flavors, or allowing opportunistic organisms to gain a foothold before the lactic acid bacteria establish dominance. For Sichuan Kai in northern China, this timing is critical. The Napa cabbages come to maturity in autumn. They are harvested, processed, and packed into crocks just as temperatures begin to decline toward winter levels. The cooling air essentially acts as a natural fermentation regulator, helping the process develop at the right pace. By the time deep winter arrives and temperatures drop further, the fermentation is largely complete. The Sichuan Kai has reached its target acidity and is now stable even through the coldest months. Sun drying also benefits from seasonal timing, though in the opposite direction. The clearest, driest days for drying tend to come in certain seasons, depending on the region. Planning Gankai production around the right weather window, maximize drying efficiency, and minimize the risk of vegetables developing mold during the drying process. Climate was never something that traditional Chinese cooks worked against. It was a tool they incorporated into their preservation strategies deliberately. Season after season, generation after generation, and all of that accumulated seasonal knowledge produced a body of preserved foods that have outlasted the necessity that created them. Here is a question worth sitting with. Refrigeration exists everywhere in China today. Modern cold chain logistics mean that fresh vegetables are available year-round in most cities. Supermarkets are well stocked. The urgent survival-level need that originally drove these preservation methods has largely disappeared for most people. So why are Sichuan Kai, Pao Kai, Mei Kai, and Gan Kai still everywhere? The answer is that these foods were never only about survival. Preservation changed the vegetables. It created flavors and textures that did not exist in the fresh state. Sichuan Kai has a sourness and a fermented complexity that fresh Napa cabbage will never have. Mei Kai has an umami depth that no amount of cooking fresh mustard greens will produce. Pao Kai has a crunch and a brightness that a raw carrot simply does not replicate. These are not inferior versions of fresh vegetables held over from necessity. They are distinct foods with their own flavor identities, their own culinary roles, and their own devoted admirers. Beyond flavor, fermented and preserved vegetables carry genuine nutritional benefits. Lactic acid fermentation increases the bioavailability of certain nutrients and produces beneficial compounds. The probiotic aspect of live fermented vegetables, those with active bacterial cultures, is increasingly supported by nutritional research. Traditional knowledge about the gut health benefits of fermented foods is being confirmed in modern scientific literature, though Chinese households were eating Pao Kai for its taste long before the word probiotic existed. And then there is tradition itself. Foods like Sichuan Kai hot pot in northeastern China are not just dishes. They are loaded with memory and identity. Making Pao Kai at home in Sichuan connects a person to their parents and grandparents, to the specific flavors of a specific household and a specific place. That kind of connection is not replaceable by a refrigerator or a supermarket shelf. These preservation methods are a record of ingenuity stretching back centuries. They represent Chinese households working within the constraints of their time and their environment, observing the behavior of food and microbes, testing methods, refining results, and passing hard-won knowledge down through generations. The refrigerator did not erase that knowledge. It revealed that the knowledge was always about more than keeping food cold. It was about transformation, flavor, and the quiet mastery of natural processes. That is why a jar of Pao Kai sitting on a Sichuan kitchen counter in 2026 is still exactly where it belongs. The methods Chinese households developed to preserve vegetables without refrigeration were not workarounds or compromises. They were complete, sophisticated systems built on real science understood through practice long before it was understood through theory. Salt, fermentation, drying, vinegar, and seasonal timing worked together to solve a genuine challenge, and in doing so, created a preserved vegetable tradition that shaped one of the world's great cuisines, and continues to influence how people eat, cook, and connect with food today. If you think Chinese vegetable preservation, watch how they actually preserve meat without refrigeration.